Inside this chaotic Pandora's box of 3D prints, wires, and boards is all the progress that I've made on my RB-2H DIY retro handheld project over the last couple of months. I've been meaning to make this video for a long time, but the progress has been so fast and so much that I just haven't been able to find a good time to make the video. However, today, unfortunately, there's been a bit of a tragedy, so now seems a good time to let you know the progress and let you know what happened. Let's get to it. Hello and welcome to Retro Breeze. So yeah, this box contains all of my progress on the RB-2H retro handheld project. In case you don't know what I'm going for here, you can check out my previous video, which I'll link on screen now. But basically, this is my own DIY retro handheld, based on a Radsta Zero SBC. So first of all, let me go over some of the progress I've made. First of all, I've been able to power up the LCD display using the pads on the display and the pins on the Radsta Zero. That means one USB connection has been reduced to simply 2 wires, which is great. Secondly, I've come a long way with the design. So first of all, I was going to go for a design that looked a bit like the Powkiddy RGB10 Max 2, and I actually 3D printed a design that I made that looks kind of like that. And it came out really well, but in the end, I just wasn't really happy with how similar it was to that device. I decided that rather than going this direction, I wanted to make the front plate, so kind of like the front face of my device, to look very distinct. I wanted you to look at this and know that it's mine. So I set about redesigning the whole thing. But before I get to that, there is a huge conceptual change on this device I need to go over first, and that is in terms of the controls. So originally I was trying to decide whether to go with 2 analog sticks or 1, and whether to go with a PS Vita style D-pad. But the more that I was working on this project, the more complex it felt to add these analog stick controls. And when I really considered the type of game that I was going to be playing on this, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was kind of a waste to have these analog sticks. At the very most, this board can play PSP and Dreamcast to an extent, but probably not perfectly. And so, at the most I needed 1. But I didn't really want to do a device with just 1 analog stick either. So when I really considered that I would mostly be playing 2D retro games, I decided to ditch the analog sticks altogether. But I also didn't want to go with just a D-pad and face button setup like every other handheld. So taking some inspiration from the Neo Geo Pocket Color and a YouTuber named Akaki Kumeri who made a Super Smash Bros. Controller similar to this, I decided instead to create this clicky digital stick. Now this isn't an analog stick or a slider or anything like this. It's actually a circular array of 4 lever arm switches, and in each direction you push, it clicks one of those switches. Pushing a diagonal pushes 2 switches at once, and the result is an extremely satisfying, clicky effect where it's just super fun and tactile and responsive. It feels a little bit like an arcade stick, but a bit lighter than that, and of course in a portable format. And I'm really happy with how this came out. In fact, here's a little bit of gameplay on the LCD from the Radsta Zero using the controls I hooked up here. And yeah, it just works great, and it's a unique solution to make my device stick out from the crowd. So let me go over how these controls work real quick. As I said before, there's a circular array of switches, which basically just means there's 4 switches in a square, not a circle, but anyway. And they're all facing in the same direction, just rotated 90 degrees each time. Now the lever arms themselves have enough tension to spring the stick back to the center after pushing in a direction. So it's actually very simple. It's basically just 4 buttons. As for the face buttons, I'm using these, I think they're called G77 silicone push buttons, and it's kind of an alternative to a membrane connection. They're basically individual membrane switches. However, to be perfectly honest, I really don't like these. They feel kind of mushy, they don't have a nice kind of heavy thunk that I prefer on membrane buttons, especially the ones from the Nixie Joy-Cons. It just kind of feels a bit hollow. So I may actually end up switching these out for some clicky switches as well. But to be honest, the stick is already so clicky that I'm not sure it would be a great idea to make the face buttons clicky as well. So we'll have to wait and see, and just kind of see how it ends up. It's pretty easy to switch the buttons out for different ones. It doesn't take a lot from a design perspective. In fact, as long as they're 8mm squared, it would take absolutely no changes on the design level. So I'll see. I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to do here yet. Anyway, so all 4 stick switches and the 4 face button switches are wired up to a wave share RP-2040. And this is an incredible little board actually, it's unbelievably good. It has a huge number of GPIO inputs and is readily usable on the RR configurator, so it's super easy to use and program. I've just wired in start select and a hotkey button as well, just for testing purposes. So yeah, all of these switches are wired into the RP-2040, and that just plugs into the board with USB. Now, in the end, all of this is going to be inside the RB-2H itself. So I have these USB hub modules, and this is exactly the same as any other USB hub you would get for your PC, but instead of being a cable with a connector and ports, it's basically just the board itself. So 4 of these holes basically act as the connection to the computer, and then the other 3 sets of 4 are basically USB devices, and you just cut the cables open and wire them in or whatever you're going to do. So this should be a really simple solution to get the Pico on the inside working without a huge bulky hub or cable. But yeah, the controls are working great. I had some issues with the diagonals originally, but it ended up being an issue with the software and the way that I had set the controller up, not the actual design, but the design works really great. I do want to say though that before I went with this design, I was using full-size arcade switches, and it looked like this. And if I'm honest, this was the best iteration of the clicky stick that I made. It was just so tactile and clicky and just really, really satisfying. But unfortunately, because of the size of the switches and the pins, I ended up having to size up the device a huge amount. I had to extend the width of it by nearly 3 centimeters just to fit all the switches on. And at that point, it was just way too wide for the screen size and what I wanted to go for. It was going to be huge, and it just kind of seemed like a waste. I may revisit this concept of using full-size switches and maybe make just like a gamepad, or even a bigger device that's arcade focused. I think that might be cool as well. But for the RB-2H, I decided to go back to the smaller switches, which are still snappy and satisfying to use, so it's not a great loss. And I think the compromise between the overall width of the device and the clickiness and satisfaction of the stick is good enough to use the smaller switches. So anyway, back to the design. Like I said, I wanted this to have a distinct front face, and with the clicky stick in place, and all designed and everything, and the face buttons which are very large and I pulled them out of a Nixie Joy-Con, I was able to model this really, really nice looking front face that you can see here. And I 3D printed this too, and it looks absolutely great. Now this isn't the end of the design, it's not going to just look like this. In fact, I'm going to go for a design which has some grips as well, and of course shoulder buttons. But I'm still very much in the design phase for that, so here's kind of what it looks like at this point. But yeah, still working on this, but I think this is actually pretty close to completion. There's not all that much to do except for actually test these inputs, which, as I'll explain a little bit later, will probably be a bit difficult, at least in the near future. But regardless, the next thing I did on here was to add a couple of speakers. These are just small 1 watt 10mm speakers, but unfortunately I discovered they're more like in-ear speakers, so they're very, very, very quiet, barely audible even in a silent room, so I definitely need to take these back to the drawing board too. Although that's not really an issue, because I might just pull them out of some old devices I am just not really using anymore, but we'll see. Shouldn't be an issue anyway, I'm not worried about it. So all that said, let's talk about the problem, and believe me, this actually just happened earlier today as I'm recording this audio, and I'm a little bit heartbroken about it, to be honest. So I've actually been working on a power solution, and here's what that looks like. There's a battery that goes into a LiPo battery charger board, which then goes out to a voltage step-up converter. And yeah, I don't know an awful lot about this, I've just kind of read a lot of tutorials and stuff. Anyway, the step-up converter steps up the voltage from 3.7 volts from the battery to 5.1. Now the Radster 0 supports 5 with some tolerance, and 5.1 should give it more than enough juice for everything it ever needs to do. I believe the tolerance is 5 to 10% or something like that. So anyway, this then would go out to the Radster 0 and power it up, and it does work. I tried it and it works perfectly. This battery is a little bit small, it would probably only last an hour or so, but I plan to get a much bigger battery eventually anyway. So what we have here is a fully working power solution, but I can't show it to you. And that's unfortunately because I really wanted to minimize the Radster 0 board. And I didn't want to go overboard, but what I did want to do is to remove the GPIO headers from the board. And at first I tried this weird technique I saw before where you slather the whole thing in solder and melt it all off at once. And that just didn't work, but I was able to clean it up with a solder pump. So then I just thought, well, why don't I just clip them off? And it was going really, really well. and I thought I was being really careful. But unfortunately, as you can see here, I actually snipped this component, and maybe even some of the traces as well, but I don't think that will be a huge issue. But this component being clipped, unfortunately, has basically bricked my board. So this is dead. I may be able to fix it. I'm not exactly sure what this component is, but I've inquired with the company and on their Discord to maybe try and find out if this is something I can just take off and put on a new one. If it's a, I don't know, resistor or capacitor or, I don't know, any of this other electrical stuff I'm not too familiar with. If I can just pull it off and put a new one on and it's fixed, it should be alright, unless any of the scraping on the side of the board has caused an issue, but I don't see how it would. But for all intents and purposes, this project is unfortunately dead right now. I would just buy another Adds2Zero, but they're not readily available as they used to be. In fact, they may have been discontinued. And you can definitely buy them like on AliExpress and even eBay, but they're very low spec for a very high price. So mine, I think, has 8 gigs of RAM, and I didn't pay all that much for it. But the ones on AliExpress now seem to be very low spec for a pretty high price. So I don't really know what I'm going to do here. I may end up having to just front the cost and buy a new board. Or I could use a different board, but that would change the internal design of the whole thing, and I don't know if the screen is going to work properly. The power distribution might be different, and it just feels like a lot to kind of throw away. And to be honest, this board is such high spec, I would hate to just waste it. So yeah, this was really bad on my part. I feel really awful for just wrecking the board, just being careless. Clipping off the headers was such a stupid idea. On reflection, I don't even know why I tried, but it is what it is. I'm not going to cry over spilled milk. I'm just going to see if I can replace this component. Perfect, I'll do that. If I can't replace the component, then I'll see what I have to do next. I do have some Raspberry Pi Zeros, the old ones, and those will serve as a drop-in replacement, at least temporarily, for testing and stuff like that. For testing hardware like the controls and the screen and stuff like that, it should work, but I'm still not particularly happy with that. But yeah, we'll see where we go from here. I'm not going to stop the project, I'm not going to give up on it at all. If I have to end up using a Raspberry Pi Zero permanently, I'll just do that. Because, to be honest, most of this design is the actual 3D design and the controls, not necessarily the board that I happen to plug into the screen at the end. But I still do want to go with my original spec of using the Adds2Zero if I can. So yeah, that's it for this project update for now. I'm not sure when I will do another update for the project because of the board issue, but hopefully it will be sooner rather than later. If I manage to fix or replace the board, I will do an update and show you it all in action. And of course, I'll continue doing the 3D design on my computer in the meantime as well. So yeah, that's it for this one. Thanks for your patience in this part 2 update. Like I said, I had intended to do one a month, but I made like no progress in a whole month and then just a huge amount in the last couple of weeks. Of course, until this morning when I broke the board. So yeah, glad to get this one out anyway. Please be sure to subscribe to the channel if you want to see the further updates to this DIY project. Leave a like on the video if you liked it, and let me know in the comments below if you have any feedback or suggestions or anything else. If you happen to know what this part of the Adds2Zero board is, definitely let me know because I would love to know if I could just replace it. I'm aware it's a surface mount component, but I have some experience swapping those out, so I should be able to do it, I think. But yeah, just let me know. Alright, thanks very much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon.